This is the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. And today I welcome back once again my good friend, Amy McElroy. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Rebecca. Lovely to be here as always.
Well, can we just start off by telling people you're not in England today, are you?
No, I'm not.
Where are you? Because it sounds wonderful.
I'm in Spain at the moment. So I flew out on Thursday and I'm here for 5 weeks.
Oh, it sounds lovely and tropical.
It's very hot here today.
Well, it sounds better than here. You know, it's been raining here for a week, so I would rather
very
have
nice sea breeze. So that's good. Yeah.
Oh,
it is hot today.
Oh, I'm so jealous right now. Okay, jealousy aside, we are here to talk about history.
Yes.
And we have covered so many different topics on the show, the two of us together. And I kind of want to circle back to one of them that I think was the first one that we talked about was your book, Educating the Tudors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And when we talked about that, we really kind of talked about the basics of education and what that looked like. But today we want to look more at like the schools. Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's definitely different types of schools and things like that, which we can definitely dig into.
That's really what I want to talk about, because when I think about education in the Tudor era, I always think about one of two things. I think about kids being educated at home by their mothers, and then I think about them going off to a university, and there's like no in between. And I think I really want to understand what that process looks like, who is allowed into different types of institutions, what actually existed. This is like all the stuff I want to talk about today. So do you want to start off maybe with the homeschooling? That's what I'm going to call it, is homeschooling, and when that started and maybe what that looked like.
Yeah, of course. So homeschooling was, well, there's probably two aspects of it, really. So some people were taught at home by their parents, but it was very limited to what their parents knew. So the wealthier you were, it was more likely that your parents were well educated. So they would have been able to teach more. However, the wealthier you were probably more likely to have a tutor, especially if you were male. So it seems to have been the mother's responsibility that would originally start off a child's education, specifically around their prayers. Obviously, the church was vital at that point in time. So the first thing that they learnt would have been their prayers and things like that. And obviously the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and whether they understood what they were saying was largely based on their social status. So if they were wealthy and went on to learn Latin, then obviously they would have understood what that prayers meant. Others would have learnt by memory. So they may not have necessarily understood the words, but they knew their prayers off by heart. So the mum would usually start with that, possibly handwriting if the mum could, and spelling, so their ABC. But yeah, if you were a little bit wealthier, when you got to around 6, 7, then you'd probably find that a tutor would be brought in. It might be shared with other children, especially if you are one of the aristocracy and you have other children in your care from other families. So you may be living outside of your home, but you're brought up with other children and then get to share their tutor. So, yeah.
When you talk about that, that makes me think of people like Edward VI, when he was a prince. And he was educated, obviously, by the best of the best. But he wasn't really educated alone because he had what he would probably later call friends who were, how did that look exactly? Like, did he have private tutoring and then had sessions with him and some other kids his age? Do you know?
He would have shared his lessons with his tutors, whether they shared all of them, I'm not sure, but he did make friends. And there is a rumor that one of them was his whipping boy. Um, I don't I don't know if that's true. For a start, I can't see somebody whipping a royal prince and surviving. So, um, but who knows? But I think either that or Edward was very well behaved and didn't need whipping at all. So his whipping boy got away with it. But they actually did stay in contact when his friend left England, so they continued to write to each other. So yeah, he did share his lessons and made friends in the classroom.
Yeah, that friend too, I think was his name Barnaby?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's like one
What?
of those names that you actually
It
like you
sticks in your
remember.
head. Yeah.
Well, one of the other things that you talked about in your book that kind of came as a surprise to me that I had never heard about before were schools that were attached to, I want to say cathedrals or maybe abbeys or stuff like that. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yes, so with the church being so important, they were very involved in education. So, particularly monasteries, so monks were generally the well-educated people of the church. They went on to study theology and things like that. And they would often found schools. So it could be as in a room in a church, it could be as part of the monastery, and they were tasked with teaching the local children. Some would obviously have the more wealthier children whose parents were willing to pay. Um, Others would teach whoever they could because it was seen as a responsibility of the church to teach local children. And dependent on the size of the monastery, the education of those within it would ultimately result in what your education looked like. So if you were lucky and you had somebody that had gone on to study theology, things like that, then you could expect a very good education, whereas you might be taught by a priest who knew Latin, but he may not even be able to write. So it largely was the luck of the draw. If you were lucky enough to go to one of the more wealthy monasteries or churches, cathedrals, then chances are you were going to receive a better education than a small village church, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I recently had you on to talk about Erasmus.
Hmm.
Can you refresh everybody's memory a little bit about what his education looked like?
Yeah, sure. So Erasmus, his father was a scribe. So he could transcribe texts into Latin and Greek. So he was um, very good at his job. So I think he saw education as really important. So Erasmus started school quite early, around 4. He did move to other schools as he grew up, including one at Deventer. His mum moved with him to stay close by. Sadly, he lost his mum at an early age through to plague, and he was recalled back to his father at the time, who died the next year. So he was left in the care of 3 guardians. They wanted to send him to a monastery, and Erasmus was very insistent on going to university, but he did know that he had to finish his formal education first. So he did go to a monastic school. And I think that is where he fell in love with learning Latin. But once he'd concluded his formal education, he was very insistent that he wanted to go to university. Sadly, his guardians had mm, spent his inheritance, so he was stuck with no choice really because he was also illegitimate.
Mm.
So he had no way of making his own way in the world. Well, at the time he thought so. He obviously did make his own way in the world. So he submitted and he went into a monastery and seems to have read absolutely everything he could get his hands on. He did end up going to university, thank you to the Bishop of Cambrai, who eventually agreed that he would pay for him to go to university, and he did his BA, and he later actually got his doctorate as well. So it took him a very long time. But I think it's probably because costs involved in travel and things like that, that he was never, when he was a student anyway, he was never wealthy enough to travel to where he wanted to go to be able to study. So it took him a long time, but he got there and obviously wrote all those fantastic works for us. So
Yeah, he's one of the most recognizable names in 16th century history when it comes to scholars, isn't he?
he definitely is. Yeah, he's a fascinating character.
He is. Remind everybody when your book about him should be coming out.
It should be early next year. I don't know if it's February or March yet, but I will
Okay.
keep you updated.
Well, as soon as pre-ordering is ready, you have to let me know so I can share that with everybody.
Thank you. I will.
And now that we've talked about Erasmus, now I want to kind of like look at and compare maybe what the education for another person that you've written about, Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII. So, you just explained what Erasmus's growing up and education looked like, and he did not come from a royal family. What did it look like for Mary in contrast?
Mary received a very good education. We believe she was taught to write by her mother, Elizabeth of York. Like their handwriting is very similar, and even Henry's as well. So we think that she did teach Mary, Henry, and Margaret to write. But she did obviously grow up in the royal nursery, so she was surrounded by ladies in waiting. And for Mary, a large part of her education would have been how to run a household. But she did also have an academic education, so that was largely led by tutors. So she would share some of Henry's tutors. She also had a French companion called Jane Poppincourt that was brought over to help her learn and speak French fluently, which we know she did. So I think she was given a lot of resources to give her the best education possible. And she was also tutored by, for instance, William Hone and John Palsgrave, and the latter of which she actually took with her when she left for France, but he then acted as her French secretary instead. So I think she was quite fond of her French tutor by the end of her education. But she did learn French, obviously, Latin. Other parts of that would have been kind of along the lines of a humanist curriculum. So not to the extent of Henry, because he was male, so it was deemed more appropriate for him to have a very thorough education. But Mary would read some of the, well, what we'd call ancient authors, but just not to the extent of her brother. But she did share some of his tutors, we do know that, and obviously had her own as well as Henry came to conclude his education. But then she would have been learning things like how to use herbs for healing, things like that. Margaret Beaufort was apparently very accomplished in that, so she had a perfect role model in her grandmother, as well as like things like household accounts. So you've got to know how your household is running. So what are your servants being paid? What's going backwards and forwards to market. Obviously, as a princess, it's a little bit different because you're not going to do all of that yourself, but you are expected to have an overall view. For instance, Elizabeth of York, she signs every page of her accounts. So she was obviously checking them to make sure everything was correct and nobody was stealing from her or anything like that. So Mary would have been taught the same as well. So yeah, and obviously then you've got the fun stuff like dancing and music and singing and horse riding. So she would have had all of that as well.
I always like to make the comparisons because when I'm researching the Seymours, they were country gentry, which is just like a different level too. I mean, you have the normal everyday subjects of England, right? And then you have the country gentry in there, and then you have what I would, the aristocracy and the
Hmm.
royalty. So what, when it comes to like the Seymours, and of course I have my own idea from doing the research, but I want to hear it from you because you've really looked at education. How different was educating a kid who was the child of somebody who, was country gentry like the Seymours?
It would largely depend on the parents, to be honest. Some parents were very keen on education. Others thought it was essentially a waste of time, other than basics. So, for somebody of country gentry, if they had parents that genuinely thought education was worthwhile, they probably did have tutors, or they'd be sent to another household, one that was a bit higher up on the social scale, if they could manage that. They also might be sent to Oxford or Cambridge. They might not complete their degree, but they might be sent for a period of time. And then they also might join one of the Inns of Law as well. Again, maybe not qualify as a lawyer, but they would be taught things like contracts so they could manage their own estates and things like that. So obviously that would have been important for country gentry as much as it's important for the aristocracy. So yeah, if they were lucky enough, then they would have got some kind of education. The aristocracy were obviously next level, so they would send them off to Europe to do a bit of a tour as their conclusion to their education. So they'd finish off their language skills and learn about different customs of different countries, whereas country gentry probably didn't do that last step. They would have been satisfied with learning about contract law and things like that, so they could manage their own country estates.
Well, this kind of explains a little bit too about Jane Seymour when she became queen, that she maybe wasn't as prepared as some of her
Hmm.
predecessors.
Yeah, definitely. So if you're not brought up in the royal court, then you wouldn't know a lot of the customs. And you know, I think all of the ladies back then would have known the hierarchy and the social status, but if you're not interacting with it, then you can probably see why she was much more unprepared than others. So I feel bad for her in that case. So it is probably was a bit of a shock to the systems, but yeah,
She figured it out for a little
she did.
while.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought up like the university and the Inns of Law. I've been reading Joanne Paul's book on Thomas More, and
Hmm.
she kind of covers the inns and stuff. Before we go too much into that, help me understand a timeline for what it looks like for education age-wise for these kids. When did they start? When were they done with the most basic? When could they advance to something more?
Well, it shouldn't be surprising, but there was no official timelines for schools. You could join a dame school, for instance, which was very, very basic. A dame school was largely aimed at both. It was local children, so it could be girls or boys. If they were fortunate enough to have somebody that could teach writing, they would, but it ultimately focused on their spelling, their prayers. They may be taught when they're a little bit older, things like embroidery that they could then practice at home. Obviously, if they're girls, they can help their mum with things like that as they grow older. Um, and then you've got petty schools as well that were a little bit older, so they were around 7 years old. And they would again be taught reading and writing, but it ultimately depended on the skill of the tutor. So some petty schools had brilliant tutors and they could teach reading and writing, and they may also teach things like arithmetic, possibly French if they knew it themselves. And then if you were going in onto college, you'd probably go to grammar school first, but again, there's no age. It was grammar schools were largely for the wealthier people on in England at the time. But ultimately, you could go to Oxford or Cambridge from around 14 years old. So
Wow.
very, very young. The timeline that you were at college would depend on what you wanted to do. So, as we mentioned earlier, some people wouldn't stay. They would learn specific things, and then that was their time done. They didn't need their degree. Others would spend years. So, theology was at the time known as the highest of the arts. So, they would have to take their bachelor's and then their doctorate. And it was 7 years to get their doctorate. So, a long, long time.
Yeah.
But that was seen as the highest one. So there were various timelines. It
Mm,
depended on what subject you wanted to do.
interesting. Well, this book, like I said, I'm reading about Thomas More. One of the things that caught my attention that I had not considered prior to reading this was that a person like, let's use Thomas More as example, when it came time for him to get married, he
Hmm.
actually looked for a wife who was well educated, knowing that she would teach their children.
Yeah.
Like that kind of blew my mind a little bit. I didn't hadn't even considered that that would be part of the process of considering a bride.
I think for somebody like Thomas More, um, you can understand why. So he was obviously very well educated himself. He'd been to college, he'd been to the Inns of Court, and I think he saw education as very important. So we know that his daughter, Margaret, she was extremely well educated. So I think he knew that he wanted his children to have that same level of education as he had. So that's what he was considering when he was looking for a partner.
Yeah, well, it worked out well for him in the end, didn't
Hmm. Yeah.
it? Let's talk about the Inns of Court. And can you help me understand exactly what that is? Because I feel like you see it all the time, and without diving into it and researching it, I'm like, what exactly is it? What are they teaching there?
Yes, so definitely. So the Inns of Court were essentially there was four of them. And they were all in London, surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly enough. Um, and they were known as like the third and fourth tiers of education. So, um, obviously, you can judge by the name that people would go there who wanted to become lawyers. But as we did mention earlier, people also attended if they just wanted to get a bit about, for instance, contract law, things
Yeah.
like that. Um, and you could actually study common law there. Um, if you wanted to become a lawyer, of course, if you weren't treating it as a finishing school, for instance. But depending on which one you went to, would be where you essentially practiced later on.
Hmm.
So part of their qualification was that they'd do their studies and then they'd have to teach themselves. So they'd have to deliver lectures in order to become qualified. And you would lecture in the Inn of Court that you had studied at yourself. So it was kind of like passing the skills down. So you repaid your education by then teaching the younger ones below you.
Interesting. Okay. So you know how this goes with me. You never know where my mind is going to go. And I feel like when we talk about court and we talk about trials when it comes to the
Hmm.
Tudor period, and all that comes to mind for me is Anne Boleyn's trial. You like immediately that's the first thing I think of. But there were regular trials, I would assume, on a daily basis too, where these men, because I'm presuming it's mostly men that were educated as lawyers, like women probably weren't allowed.
No,
Yeah.
definitely not, sadly.
So I like, how long were they educated on law before they were put into action?
So with Anne Boleyn's trial, technically it's canon law because it's to do with the church. So for a doctorate in canon law, you had to study 3 years of civil law first,
Oh,
and then you had to teach canon law for 5 years.
wow.
So, yes, it was a very long road to become a doctor in canon law. Now, obviously, you didn't have to be a doctor to be able to be a judge or whatever, but they would have been the people that had all of the knowledge that probably should have been around for Anne Boleyn and, well, definitely the divorce for Catherine. But yes, Anne Boleyn's trial, yeah, I don't think they went as far as having any doctors of canon law there.
They didn't need to.
No, but they definitely should have done for Catherine's, would be my opinion, for Catherine and Henry's divorce proceedings. They definitely should have had some doctors of canon law there.
I love conversations like this because we're looking at a different aspect of the Tudor life that I feel like we
Mm,
don't talk about very often. Like there was more than just the drama and the interpersonal relationships. There
yeah.
was this whole side that really built the person.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Let's shift now to higher education, which we would call it today with universities.
Hmm.
And I feel like there's so much I don't know when it comes to universities in England. And like, what was the first, do you know what was the first university in England? Who was the patron of it? Any of that?
Oxford and Cambridge are basically made up of lots of small colleges. So they either one could have been fast, but during the Tudor time, there was more colleges being founded. So we know that Margaret Beaufort founded two colleges. So and then Wolsey. So I think it was very much a important factor to found these colleges. And obviously, a lot of them have kept their original names, like Christ's College and things like that. So, very, very traditional names. But yes, they're both made up of lots of smaller colleges. And when you look at the people that actually attended during the Tudor period, it is like this big circle of friends. So like one taught the other and then they taught the next one and they shared tutoring jobs and all sorts. It's yeah, it looks like this little happy circle, happy social circle.
Okay, so for someone like Margaret Beaufort, who founded a university or a college, what what do you think the reasoning was behind her doing something like that? Was it for image or was she really interested in education? Do we know?
I think there are a couple of elements to this. So royals are meant to be charitable. So I think there is an aspect of that. And because education was becoming more and more popular under the Tudors with the Renaissance coming and all of that, I think it was seen as, okay, we can help here. So I don't think Margaret Beaufort ever would have done it for, hey, look at me, look what I've done. I think she genuinely cared. So we know that she had many, many books herself, and she would work on translations herself. So I think she was a brilliant role model for her grandchildren. And I think she genuinely wanted to help other people with an education. So by founding a college, she could help that because they could stipulate things like, as an example, they may say, um, from the funds you educate 100 poor children every year, something like that. And it was their way of helping the less fortunate who couldn't necessarily attend Cambridge or Oxford or the Inns of Court. So yeah.
Nice. I like that story.
Yeah.
And then as far as the teachers or the professors at these colleges and universities, What credentials did they need to have? Did they just go for a couple years and go, well, now I can teach too. I know what I need to know.
Pretty much. So at the colleges, they'd obviously take their degree. If they were taking their doctorate, part of that would be that they had to deliver lectures. Um, but it does seem quite mixed. So like if we go back to Erasmus, he was visiting Cambridge and he was only visiting, so he wasn't necessarily enrolled there. Um, and he was asked to lecture. So yeah, it's a little bit odd, but I suppose he did have a bit of a reputation at that time, so you can probably understand why. But there doesn't seem to be any specific, so you didn't have to have your doctorate to teach then, but you did have to teach if you wanted your doctorate. So yeah, and it does seem like a lot of the tutors that we know of went on to teach at the colleges that they were enrolled at themselves. So I think it's safe to say that they really enjoyed education and wanted to continue their own as well as help others.
Yeah, well, there's a freedom that comes with being educated. And obviously, we know that the men were the ones who were afforded that freedom the
Yes,
most. Is there any indication of women joining these institutions during this time?
not during the Tudor period, no. So I
Wow.
think the better educated ladies would have been the aristocracy that they were either expected to have quite a decent education, nowhere near what a boy would be expected to have. But obviously, we do know that some exceeded expectations. For instance, Margaret More, Elizabeth I, Mary the First, Lady Jane Grey. So they exceeded expectations for what a female should learn, but they were in a very fortunate position that they had, first of all, supportive parents who wanted them to have that kind of education, barring Lady Jane Grey to an extent, and then the resources to be able to pursue it as well. So even into adulthood, we know that they were continually um, reading, doing translations, things like that. So they continued their education of their own accord when technically they'd already finished, they'd formalized their education, but they chose to carry on.
Yeah. Oh, and I think we as humans are the same today, right? We continue to read to educate
Yeah,
ourselves because there's no better way.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, Amy, I feel like we've kind of covered so many different bases today. Is there a
Mhm.
part of the education of the tutors that I'm missing out when it comes to the schools and colleges or any of that?
I think the only other thing that I'd probably add in is apprenticeships were quite interesting. So apprenticeships were popular under the Tudors, and you obviously had different guilds, so like the goldsmiths and that kind of thing. And it's interesting that during the Tudor period, a lot of them started to formalize their rules, and a lot of them began to put in things like they had to have this many years education before they could become an apprentice, or they had to be able to read, they had to be able to write. And that was stipulated. So if you were going to take on an apprentice, it was then your responsibility to give them that education.
Hmm.
So a lot of them were, you can take the apprentice on, but you need to make sure that they're receiving this type of education. So they would either have to have tutors for their apprentices or they would send them to school. So I think that's quite interesting that even the apprenticeships became more formalized around academic education as well, and not just whatever skills they were learning.
Yeah. I keep going back to men being educated at these places and the women not being allowed. And I feel like if I were to put myself into 16th century England, and let's say I come from a family that has enough money to send at least the eldest son to university, I feel like as a younger sister, I would be like begging him to teach me what he has learned.
Yes. There was actually an apprenticeship for girls that was the silkwomen.
Oh,
Yeah, so they were the closest thing you could get to a guild, but they weren't an official guild because obviously it was made up of women. But they used to create all the really intricate, like the buttonholes, tassels for clothing, all the really fine details, and they were really very, very skilled at their work. And they would actually take on young girls as apprentices. So there was that opportunity. And obviously, there were convents that would give an education for girls, but I completely agree with you that there was no chance that you were going off to Oxford or Cambridge,
yeah.
sadly. So I'd probably be begging my older brother to teach me too.
Right. Well, that's just the thing. If you're a woman in the 16th century in England and you're not of the aristocracy or the royal family, like your level of education is not going to be as high as everybody else. So some of those women were then sent to a monastery where they would get a better education than they would have if they were left at home. I find that amazing, like that there was that option there for them.
Yeah, definitely. And um, I know we keep saying this, but some of the convents would have been better prepared than others. So it ultimately comes down to the wealth of the convent. So if you had if you were fortunate enough to go into a wealthy convent, chances are they had well-educated nuns within. So they would definitely help. If you went to a very small one, you probably would have learned Latin at least, but you probably weren't going to come out knowing a lot about arithmetic or geography or anything like that. So, but the opportunity was there, and I think it was, well, up until the dissolution, it was a good thing that the convents were doing to try and provide an education for young girls.
Yeah. And I feel like if you're a young girl, you don't have the financial means, and maybe having a family is not high priority for you, that joining a convent would be the way to go to educate
Yeah.
yourself, really.
Yeah, definitely. If you could obviously go to the convent for your education if you didn't want to take your vows, but you would be required to pay then. So that was largely done by those that could afford it. But alternatively, yes, if you wanted to join the convent and take your vows, then yeah, probably the best way to get an education if you can't take on a tutor yourself.
It really does remind us how lucky we are today as women to be able to be
Definitely.
educated at
We've
whatever
come a
level.
long, long way since then. Yeah.
Yes, we have. Well, I think that's the perfect note for us to end on
Yeah.
this episode, Amy. I want to give you an opportunity, as always, to plug your books and tell people where they can find them and find you on social media.
Thank you. So my first book was Educating the Tudors, which we've talked about today. So that spans the different ranks of society. So who was taught what and by who. And then there's obviously it covers Henry, Mary, Margaret, Arthur. My second one was Women's Lives in the Tudor Era. So that follows basically a woman's life from childhood up until death and all the different milestones in between. And then my third one was Mary Tudor, Queen of France, which came out earlier this year. So they are all available in most places that you can get books. The first two are also available in ebook version. Mary Tudor will be coming in ebook version very soon, I believe. And you can find me on I think I'm on all social media. Pretty sure I am, under my name. So yeah.
Wonderful. And I'm going to make sure to link all of your episodes that you've done with me in the show notes for this one. So if somebody's watching this, this is the first interview that they've watched with you. Now they know they can go back and watch these other ones too, because we always have a good time talking about history,
We
don't we?
do. We always end up laughing.
We do. Well, Amy, thank you so much for coming back on the show again today.
And no, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tutorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.